Hi, welcome to this episode of Faith and Logic. In this episode of Faith and Logic, we are going to answer some of the common objections to God's omniscience and God's omnipotence. We are going to answer the questions like, can God make a rock that he cannot lift? Or does God know how the pineapple tastes like? So these are some of the questions that we are going to answer in this video. So let's just begin this video by the first question. Can God make a rock that he cannot lift? Some of these questions that we are going to answer today, they are based on the Thomistic metaphysics. We are going to use Thomas Aquinas' arguments from his famous work, Summa Theologiae. And we are going to answer what does it mean to be omniscient or omnipotent based on Thomas Aquinas' work. So let's just begin answering this question. Can God make a rock that he cannot lift? And these are some of the philosophical questions that is particularly related to God's omniscience and God's omnipotent. Can God make a rock that he cannot lift? God can do all things that are logically possible. A self-contradiction is not a thing at all. Aquinas, in his works Summa Theologiae, in part 1 and question 25, he talks about that God can do all that is metaphysically possible. So a rock an omnipotent being cannot lift is like a square circle. A square circle logically is impossible. Similar to that, a married bachelor. A bachelor, by definition, is not married. So when you say a married bachelor, that is a logically impossible statement. It is a self-contradiction. So it is not possible object of power. So God can do all things that are logically possible, but things that are logically impossible, like square circle or married bachelor. So just like you're asking a question, can God make a rock that he cannot lift? You can say that, can God make a square circle? No, because it is logically impossible statement. So omnipotence means the power to actualize all possible being. It does not mean the power to actualize contradiction. This answers the question, can God make a rock that he cannot lift? God can do everything which is logically possible, but something which is logically impossible, that is something that God cannot do. Now, the next question is that, does God know what pineapple tastes like? God does not know by the sensory experience. He does not have taste buds. We all know that God is a spirit. So, we as a human being, when we want to know something, we know that throughout the sensory experiences. Like we can touch, smell, taste. So, if we want to know how the pineapple tastes like, we taste and see that, how the pineapple, whether it's sweet or whether it's sour. But God does not know anything by the sense experience, as he does not have the taste buds. But all sensory experience exists because God causes them. Thomas Aquinas, in his work Summa Theologica, part 1, question 14, he says that God knows all things by knowing himself as their cause. So God, being the cause of the existence of pineapple, he knows that. He doesn't need to know how pineapple tastes like by the sensory experiences. God knows the taste more perfectly than we do by being the cause of it. So he knows the essence of pineapple and the act of tasting it as their first cause. So God is the first cause and he knows the essence of the pineapple. God does not taste pineapple, but he knows the taste in a higher mode. So principle here is, when you say God is omniscient, God knows creature not by participation in them, but by being their cause. So God knows the creature not by participation in them, but by being their cause. God knows what tasting is better than the taster does. He knows how the pineapple tastes like better than how you know that through the sense experience. So this answers the question, does God know what pineapple tastes like? Yes, he knows that, but he doesn't know it through the sense experience by tasting the pineapple. He knows that by being the cause of the pineapple, by being the first cause. God knows your future actions. So that's how the Thomist would answer the question. Now, different philosophy will answer this in a different ways. For example, analytic philosophers would answer the same question in a different way. Like, how does God know everything? Or by being omnipotent. So, different philosophical systems would answer this question in a different way. Now, the next question that we are going to see is that does God reason from premises to conclusion? So, when we say that God doesn't know the things through the sense experience, how does God reason? Does he need to learn something? Being a human being, we have the finite knowledge. So when we are young, we learn the mathematics or we learn the language, we have to read books and we grow in our knowledge. Does God need to grow in his knowledge? We all know that God is omniscient. What does it mean? How does God know the things? Or how does God reason? Does he need to reason from premises to conclusion like we do? So let's answer this question. Humans reason discursively. God does not reason discursively. We reason from premise to inference to conclusion. So we have to think through the problem because we are finite beings. We learn. We move from ignorance to knowledge. There were certain things you did not know when you were 10 years old, but now you know that thing when you grow older, when you acquire more knowledge. So we move from ignorance to knowledge. God does not move from ignorance to knowledge. God knows all truths in one eternal act. For God to know something or for God to know your future, for God, there is no past, present, and future. Everything is one eternal act. It is one eternal now for God. So God knows all truth in one eternal act by knowing himself. When we say God is omniscient, God knows all things by knowing himself, by being the first cause of all things. So God's knowledge is not step by step like us, like a finite beings. It is simple, eternal, and immediate. Think of it this way, that we see through keyhole, but God sees the whole house at once. So this answers the question that does God reason from premises to conclusion? No, God does not reason from premises to conclusion. He knows all things. He knows all the truth. He knows everything like one eternal now, like in one eternal act by knowing himself. Now, the next question, the fourth one that we are going to see is that did God create logic? Logic reflects the structure of being. The being reflects God's nature. Logic flows from the eternal nature of God. Logic is not something which is separate from God. It reflects the way the reality is structured, and reality itself reflects who God is. So, the rules of logic, like the principle of non contradiction, that says something cannot be and not be at the same time, something cannot be A and not A at the same time. These logical principles are grounded in God's nature. God did not invent logic, but logic flows from who God eternally is. So God cannot break the logic because logic reflects his own nature. To violate logic would be to contradict himself. And that is not a weakness or lack of power when we say that God is omnipotent. To violate logic would be to contradict himself. So that is not the weakness or lack of power. It shows that God is perfectly consistent and perfectly true to his own being. So logic flows from God's eternal nature. God cannot violate logic because logic reflects his essence. To violate logic would be to deny himself, and that is not a limitation of power, it is the perfection of the being. So that's how the Thomist would answer the question of did God create logic? Now, the foundational Thomistic principle is that God is a pure act. So when we answer about God's omniscience and God's omnipotent, we have to first know that God is a pure act. In other words, God has no passive potentiality. There is an active potency in God, but there is no passive potency. And this we will see more in detail about all those 4 points in the future videos. That what does it mean that God is pure act? Then what does it mean that God is absolutely simple? God is not composed of parts. God is ipsum esse and subsistence. That means God's essence and God's existence is one. We as a finite being, we have our existence from God. For example, if you look at TV has a power cable. So when you pull the power cable from the TV is going to stop working. Similarly, we exist at some point of time and then we cease to exist when we die. But for God, his essence is existence. That's what it means when we say ipsum esse subsistence. That means that God is a subsistent being itself. Then God's attribute, whenever we talk about the goodness of God or the wisdom of God, these attributes are analogically applied and they are not univocal. So when we say James is good and when we say God is good, the goodness remains the same, but it is applied analogically to God. So we, as a finite being, we have goodness, but God is absolutely good. When we say the wisdom, so we have the wisdom, but when we say God is wise and when we say Solomon is wise, God is the source of all the wisdom. So that's what it means when we say that the attributes are analogical and they are not univocal. And this also, we will see what is univocal, what is equivocal, and what is analogical. So in Thomism, the attributes of God are applied analogically and not univocally. Now, let's just summarize this. God's omniscience, according to Thomism, God knows himself perfectly. God knows all possible things. He knows all actual things. He knows all contingent things and all the free acts. He knows them in one eternal act, as we have seen, without learning. God doesn't need to learn. He doesn't need to go from ignorance to perfection. He knows without learning, without reasoning, and without sensory experiences. So when we say that God knows how the pineapple tastes, he doesn't need to taste it without sensory input. Now, when we say God's omnipotence, according to Thomism, God can do everything that is metaphysically possible, which is logically possible. He cannot contradict himself, he cannot cease to be God, and he cannot create logical impossibilities like square circle or married bachelor. So I hope this episode has helped you understanding some of these philosophical questions that is related to God's omnipotence and God's omniscience. Can God create a rock that he cannot lift? Or does God know how the pineapple tastes like? So the next time a skeptic asks you this type of a questions, I hope you will be able to use the Thomistic metaphysics to answer these questions. You can also look into some of the analytical philosophers and see how they answered this question. I hope this episode has helped you understanding God's attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. We will discuss this in our future episodes in detail about what does it mean that God is omnipotent and God is omniscience. Thank you and God bless.